Sometimes we make the pain problem its information, and we're meant to just dig deeper.
Welcome to the TroopHR Podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Bradley. In today's episode, we're going to be examining what happens when ambition turns from fuel to friction. Today's guest, Amina AlTai, invites us to rethink the way that we chase success, redefining the word genius to identifying hidden beliefs that quietly shape our careers. This conversation is an honest, refreshing look on how we can pursue big goals without burning out. We examine all of this and what's in store in her latest book. And whether you're early in your career or leading at the highest level, there's something here for anyone who's ever wondered, is the hustle really working for me? But let's dive into it, starting at the ground floor, of course, by first asking Amina to share what the premise of her new book is all about.
The book is called The Ambition Trap: How to Stop Chasing and Start Living. And I wrote this book because I've had a front row seat to ambition in my own life and with all of my clients. And ambition is a really interesting word, especially when you study it. It's one of those culturally complex, politically loaded words that will either highlight our benefits or our quote unquote drawbacks, depending on who's being labeled. So when you look at the research, ambitious women are often seen as too much or aggressive. Ambitious men are often seen as driven and powerful. So we see that there's this inequity inside the word alone. And so I set out to reframe it and redefine it. And I think ambition in its purest form is neutral and natural. And it's simply a desire to unfold, a desire for more life. And I also think as a society, we've come to believe that ambition means more for more's sake all the time. And I think that's where we get in a bit of trouble. And so in the book, I also redefine it and say that ambition goes in cycles like a perennial flower. So we're not supposed to be growing and pushing and hard charging all the time. We're actually supposed to be growing, resting, recovering, nurturing, pacing, replenishing, growing again, and really allowing it to ebb and flow.
What an interesting and refreshing take on ambition, because I generally have fallen into the trap of there's this myopic view of ambition, and the description of tying it to seasons is one that really fascinates me about how you position this here today. How did you come to realize that this is actually a framework, if you will, rather than a static definition?
So how I actually came to this work in general was I started my career in marketing and brand management and was very ambitious in kind of the old paradigm definition, the more for more's sake, the hurt yourself to get ahead version. And in my late 20s, I burned out and I developed 2 autoimmune diseases. And it happened in this very dramatic fashion where I got a call from my doctor and she said, if you don't go to the hospital instead of going to work, you're days away from multiple organ failure. And so I call it my stop moment because I had to stop right then and there and stop everything that I was doing and choose another way. And it took 10, 15 years of study to really see how it came to be societally and culturally, and then how we could kind of rewind it and create a new path forward. And I just started to study myself and my clients too, because our clients often mirror back what we're experiencing. And I was attracting all of these really high achieving people that were getting sick or something was happening. Actually, in 2020, at the height of the social justice uprisings, I ended up coaching a handful of celebrity girl bosses who were canceled. And my book is not an analysis of cancel culture, but I think it's a really interesting reflection, right? My relationship to ambition, I took a physical hit. And these other people were losing their jobs, being called into question for their relationship to ambition. And so I just saw that we really needed a new framework.
Thank you for sharing your story on that piece. It resonates with me because I had a similar moment when I was, 22. I was doing 16-hour days, 7 days a week at a startup and ended up in the hospital.
Ooh.
And the emergency room with ulcer issues. And the doctor was just, what are you doing? And that for me was a wake up call if I needed to approach work differently. So thank you for sharing that. That certainly keyed up for me.
I love that you got the message so early too. 22 is great because we still can turn things around. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. And I'm so glad it happened young.
Yes. A yes to both is it unfortunately can take some of those moments. And the reframing of ambition when folks come to you and they may present this in a different way, so I'm open to getting your input of how it's presented to you, but to say, I am ambitious and I want to keep just going for things, but may not have a crystal clear roadmap of where they're intending to go. How do you navigate that conversation with them?
And I think it's really important to say this of I am very ambitious, right? And all my clients are really ambitious. So I'm never trying to ask people to renounce their ambition with this new framework. I'm just inviting us to be in the right relationship with it. So the old paradigm was more for more's sake, hurt yourself and others to get ahead. With this paradigm of ambition, it's how do we do it in a generative, supportive way that's great for people and the planet? And so a lot of the times when I'm inviting people to reconcile their ambition, I want to know the why behind it. Of like, why do you want the thing that you want? And it's such a simple question, but it is often a really existential one that will just start to unravel the house of cards.
That is a tough question to answer. It's one of those ones that seems simple, but if you're not listing out your why or motivator, then to your point, it's more for more's sake. And I've always said, in HR, I never wanted HR for HR's sake. And so now I'm going to start applying this to the conversation about growth as well. And on that, you mentioned the research you're doing. And that always perks up my ears. Is a lot of folks that are wanting to be ambitious and grow are often data driven. So what are some of the data nuggets that you've come across to say, if you hone your ambition this way, it'll actually propel you further in a more sustainable way?
One of the big pieces of research that I came across, first of all, there's all this data around the word ambition, around the word genius, about who gets to be ambitious, who gets to be genius. And so there's a lot of reconciling that we need to do inside of that. But I started to research the word genius because I believe that our ambition really flourishes when we work in our zone of genius. And that's my invitation for everyone to start. That's part of the why of like, how do we anchor this in our zone of genius? And tracing all the way back to ancient Rome, genius is a word that is largely used to describe men. So I was working with all these women that were like, I'm not genius at anything, so I have to be the hardest working person in the room. And so they would discount their genius, then double down on the effort. And then that was leading to burnout. That was leading to friction. That was leading to dissatisfaction. And then there was a study that came out of the 92nd Street Y, and they found that even women, like something like 93% of women actually believe that women are not genius, men are more genius. And so there was this rift that I was seeing that was causing us to overwork, overperform, because at the beliefs level, we didn't believe we were worthy and belonged in the room. And so much of the work really is rewriting the scripts in our own heads, redesigning the stories so that we can really anchor in our own genius and allow our ambition to unfold from that place, because everybody has a zone of genius.
And when folks come to you with that boxed in ideology in their head, what are some of the questions or processes that you go through with them to help break through that barrier?
Yeah, there's a whole body of work on limiting beliefs that we do. So a lot of the stories that we have aren't our own. It's really interesting, but obviously we have our unconscious brain and it's running like an operating system in the background and it's driving these choices that we have no idea about, right? So the cities that we choose to live in, the partners that we choose, and the work we choose to do are all driven by mechanisms we're not aware of. And so until we sit down to get conscious of the unconscious, it directs our life and we call it fate, as Carl Jung would say. And one body of work is just taking people through their limiting beliefs around work, around money, around success. And so what do you really believe? And are those your beliefs? Because more often than not, they're not our beliefs, right? So I used to believe that success meant 12, 15-hour days and first one in, last one out, all the shiny objects, right? Until that didn't work for me. And then I sat down and I asked myself, whose beliefs are these? They weren't mine.
And what part of what I learned early on in my career, at least through my lived experience, is sometimes this ambition or our approach to the 16-hour days isn't rewarded at that organization. And that can lead to some painful outcomes where you feel like I'm going above and beyond and it's not being rewarded. There's other organizations that will probably reward that. But that was a painful lesson I learned. And one of the things that I really enjoy about some of your framework is if you could describe for us the difference between painful and purpose when it comes to ambition.
Yeah. Yes, it's so true. A lot of the times it is not rewarded. And I also think that there's diminishing returns, right? I always tell this one story of I went to school with a bunch of people that ended up becoming accountants, and they worked at top 4 accounting firms, and they were all kind of grouped together. And the one who consistently got the highest rating year over year was the person who self-reportedly was working at 75%. And I love this story because everybody else was working at 150%. And because they were working so hard, they were burned out. They were in a bad mood. They weren't happy to be there. And people sensed that. And the person working at 75% was a joy to be around because they had a bit more balance. And so I love that story. But to your original question of the difference between painful and purposeful ambition. So in the book, I highlight that painful ambition is often coming from a core wound. So Lise Bourbeau, who's a Canadian psychologist, talks about 5 core wounds. And they are abandonment, rejection, humiliation, betrayal, and injustice. And we all have 1, 2, 3, or all 5 of these wounds. It's a very human rite of passage. As we emerge from childhood, life happens and we come out with these wounds. And it doesn't mean that our parents weren't wonderful, magical humans, right? It's just a very human rite of passage. But a lot of the times, our desire for growth is coming from that place of pain. I'll give you an example. So I have a betrayal wound. So betrayal is when you feel like your parents or caregivers didn't live up to expectations. So for every wound we have, we wear a corresponding mask. The mask for betrayal is control, right? So if I'm worried that people won't live up to my expectations, I'll control everything to make sure the outcome is okay. And I carried that into the workplace. But guess what? You cannot control everything. There's about 2 things you can control in life. And if you do try to control everything, you're going to be working way longer than everybody else, way harder, and it's not going to be that much fun. And I learned that the hard way, and that's where my ambition was coming from. And so purposeful ambition is when our ambition is coming from our why, from a place of truth, from our place of purpose.
And that, goodness, I feel like in so many conversations I had that will resonate with so many of the listeners too. We try to control on a practical level. The feedback I had early on from one of my mentors, Christine Haas, amazing leader, was if you're going to manage teams, you have to trust them. You have to enable them, right? And you can't control every single thing because then you're not going to get leverage. And that, again, I'm so thankful to have these lived experiences and then mentors that guide you through that. Now, not everyone may have a mentor available to you. So what are some signs and symptoms or precursors of going to a spillover moment that people can keep an eye out for themselves so that they can better address this before it gets to a point like that?
Yes. So you might start to notice that you're feeling a bit distant from your work, right? So a lot of us that are called to purpose-driven work, we really love our work. We're so happy to be there and go there every day. You and I started our conversation talking about that before we hit record. And so you might notice that actually you don't feel as connected to it anymore, a bit resistant to it. Maybe you have a hard time getting started around that work. Maybe you're noticing that you're a bit more short-tempered with your coworkers, clients, and other constituents, and that you're just not as excited to show up and do the thing that you used to be really excited about. And maybe you're starting to even get physical symptoms. So a lot of the times it shows up as fatigue, digestive issues, emotional challenges. And so if you're starting to see those breadcrumbs, I think it's a really great time to try to get ahead of it and sit down and ask yourself, am I in right relationship with my ambition? Do I need to redefine success for myself and kind of shift how I'm operating in work?
And pain is such an important indicator of that, right? Often pain can be viewed as strictly a bad thing, but it's that red flag giving you a heads up that, hey, something's wrong here. Yeah. And it's so critical to be in tune to that. Yes. On a practical level, I had a coworker of mine recommend I have an Aura ring.
Oh yeah, I love.
And it measures stress. And it's just really interesting to see the correlation, or when you start to have very stressful weeks, to be in tune to that, because it gives you a moment to pause and go, okay, maybe I need to take a step back and take a breather, get a better look of what's going on here.
Yes, exactly. It's all feedback. And I think sometimes we make the pain, like you said, a problem, or we make the discomfort a problem. It's not always, right? It's information, and we're meant to just dig a little deeper. That's what it's there for.
Yeah. And the types of wounds that you mentioned, as you were going through them, some resonated with me, some didn't. I'm sure everyone will have a different approach to that. But this carrying this around with us, it can be something that once you recognize there's the problem, then it's how do you start to work through that? Depending on the type of wound or where someone is, there different things that may benefit them more than others?
I believe as a coach, I always say this, awareness is 80% of the work. And so you may identify with all of the wounds, none of the wounds. If you don't identify with the wounds, I would read the masks and see if those connect with you. So I'm just going to give you all a little. So for the rejection wound, the mask is withdrawal or avoidance. For the abandonment wound, the mask is dependence, so overly dependent on others. For the humiliation wound, the mask is martyrdom, so always working, being the last one out, all those things. For the betrayal wound, it is control, which we talked about. And for the injustice wound, it is rigidity, so like black and white thinking. And so sometimes going in through the masks can be really helpful because we can see, okay, I've gotten feedback about controlling, I've gotten feedback around martyring myself or being a bit avoidant, and just starting to notice where that crops up in work and life. And it may not just show up at work, right? You also might notice it in your interpersonal relationships, in your friendships, in your romantic relationships. And so just starting to notice it. And when you notice it crop up, just asking yourself the question, can I choose another way? And by virtue of that, over time, we'll create a new neural pathway. And instead of defaulting to control, I can default to compassion or empowering others so they can do the thing, right? So just in every moment, asking ourselves, can I choose another way?
I love tying it back to going down to the neuron. Neuroplasticity is such a powerful thing, is we can reformat our brains, but it takes intentionality behind it.
Yes.
And certainly practice.
100%. I give everybody the example. So I live in New York in an apartment building, and we changed the passcode to enter our building. And for 6 weeks, every day I would go in there and I'd put in the old passcode. And then something happened. Week 6, like the 7th day of the week, my brain finally was like, we remember now. And it finally created the new neural pathway. And it's such a great example because I had to do it every day. And it's the same with our reframes and choosing again. We have to do it every day. And eventually you will create a new neural pathway.
I feel like I've just gotten good at putting 2025 instead of 2024. We all have different learning curves, but I'm getting there.
Exactly.
So the other parts too is such great tools for self-awareness. I also see your book and what you've been talking about as great for mentors to be aware of because it really structures that feedback. I certainly feel that any mentor can now sit down with your chart of the wound and the mass to start giving more direct feedback to folks. What else would you recommend for mentors to take away from your book?
I love that question. So one of my clients is the CEO of a venture fund, and I gave her an advanced reader copy of my book. And the book is filled with exercises. It is absolutely a self-help book, but every section has multiple exercises. So every week in her stand-up, she does an exercise with her team, which I think is so fun. So everything from identifying your zones of genius to how do you cultivate purpose to what does contentment look like to how do we get more intentional about our community and who we surround ourselves with to how do we reframe our limiting beliefs. And so for any mentor or leader who is looking to invite people into greater self-awareness, but not in a didactic, preachy way, but in a way that we want people to figure out for themselves, there's literally so many exercises in here. You can just open the book to any chapter and you don't have to start in order. And that's kind of one of my favorite things about the book.
The readers can't see me, so I'm writing this down because I'm going to incorporate this into our stand-up style with our team. So
I love that.
Phenomenal advice and really excited to read some of the exercises too.
Thank you so much.
So as we approach coming in for a landing here, just a few more questions for me. It really shines through your enthusiasm and your passion on this topic. And I know we touched a little bit briefly at the beginning about your personal journey, but more importantly, what are some of the things that you learned along the way that really shocked you or opened up your eyes to this avenue?
Things that I learned along the way that really shocked me. I don't know that it shocked me, but it was like, this is really interesting. When I was doing the research on zones of genius, obviously I had this hypothesis that, a lot of people reject genius because I see it in my practice every day where I'll be like, oh, it sounds like that's your zone of genius. And people will be like, no, I'm not genius at that thing. I can't claim that label. And what I started to see was that a lot of people define genius in a particular way. We think it is a single objective numerical value, right? We think it's IQ. What I learned along the way is actually IQ does not measure our intelligence. It measures how motivated people are when they take a test. And so the idea that genius could be this single objective numerical variable is kind of problematic because our genius looks all kinds of ways. And I really want people to reclaim theirs because it helps us cultivate confidence, right? If I've discounted my genius because I believe it has to look like Einstein's, I'm going to show up in a room and question myself every single day. But if I know that my power skills are by far and away my best feature, I'm going to double down on those and I'm going to feel so strong around it. And so I just feel really passionate about that. And I want everyone to realize that they have a zone of genius and it doesn't look one way.
The regulatory capture, if you will, on the term genius, I think is just too narrow.
Way too narrow.
Certainly agree with you that it's beyond that. Recognize what your spikes are. And goodness, just to reiterate, sticking to who you are is incredibly important and not trying to emulate Einstein or someone else. Again, great folks, but It's just you are who you are. The other piece of it too is it can be a difficult conversation. And I'm thinking through them live of the ones I've had where I've seen people with amazing skills, these genius centers, where they're discounting themselves regularly. That box. Any other real practical advice of how do you break down those barriers without maybe overstepping or coming across a bit too harsh for someone?
I love that question. First of all, I mean, we have to find them and own them, and then the too harsh part we'll address as well. So when I'm helping people really connect to their zones of genius, I have them first, take inventory for themselves of where are they off the charts amazing, what's innate for them, what do they not have to push, force, or really labor hard to contribute. It's just kind of their magic. And if they can't see it, I'll invite them to ask 5 of their friends who really see them, what they think their magic and their contribution is. And oftentimes people are like, this is such a lovely exercise, by the way. Nothing makes you feel better. So for people listening, I highly recommend, even if you know your zone of genius, it's just a feel-good exercise. And once we start to see that, then really starting to cultivate confidence around it. So we cultivate confidence in community spaces, right? That feels like the safest place to try new things on. So if you haven't been leaning into your zone of genius, practice it a little bit in community spaces. And what you were saying about coming off as sort of like too harsh, right? Sometimes we do a 180. It's like when we first learn about boundaries, right? We're like, oh, boundaries are a vehicle for keeping other people out. And we go from having none to having these extreme high fences in our lives, right? Boundaries are actually a vehicle to support both sides. And same with our zone of genius. So if we're over rotating and it's starting to feel like there's no space for other people to be genius or there's no space for your other attributes, we want to invite ourselves to kind of be a bit more harmonious about this of like, where am I over rotating? Are there ways that I can welcome in other skills and other people's skills so it feels like there's space for all of us? Because that over rotation is real.
100%. 2 final questions from me. I want to be respectful of your time. Is if you had to give career advice, it can be tied to the book, different, whatever it is, what career advice would you give to someone that is emerging in their career, maybe new to a field?
One thing that I love to say is that there's no right or wrong way to career. I think that especially like when I started my career, a lot of what I was told is that it's linear. You have one, it lasts a lifetime. And that didn't work for me. I'm basically on my 3rd career. And so I really want people to have permission to be themselves, whether that is a linear career that lasts a lifetime or you change 4, 5, 6, 7 times. There's no right or wrong way to career, especially if you're listening to yourself. And that doesn't mean that we're going to look flaky or flighty to the rest of the world. There's a way to do it beautifully and in integrity. But there's no right or wrong way to do it. So please be true to yourself because we spend more of our heartbeats at work than we do anywhere else. It has to feel good.
It's so true. And I feel like we need to have a whole separate podcast with you to talk about the career journey and the switches that you've made because it's so invaluable. And I wish more people would embrace that mentality. Final question from me. If people want to get a hold of your book, which I recommend, or get in contact with you, what are the best ways to do that?
Thank you so much for asking. You can buy the book anywhere you buy books. Highly recommend you seek out your favorite local bookstore, but seriously, the book is available anywhere. And then you can find me at my website, AminaAlTai.com, or on Instagram at Amina AlTai, or LinkedIn, same name, Amina AlTai.
Amina, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for sharing your platform so generously and for having me. I'm so grateful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TroopHR Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit TroopHR.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.